Hello, and welcome to Inequality Talks, a podcast from the volunteers of the Economic Inequality Group at Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke, Aarhus. Today, we will be talking about automation. And if you're not quite sure what that is, then this episode is perfect for you, because today we will be delving into the basics of what it is, what the near future of automation looks like, and what initial prospects and worries are on the horizon. I am Edward, and today with me are Adam.
Hello.
And Virginia.
Hello.
Let's start with hearing about your sort of background on the subject. How did you get into this topic, and why are you interested in the first place?
Okay, I studied engineering and I'm working with that now. So, of course, it's an important part of my background. But until a few years ago, I had never asked myself about the negative effects of automation on society, because this was not part of my background. So I was just hoping for the best and all the fantastic innovations that this can bring. But I think with the volunteering here at MS or by reading other stuff on my own in the last year, then I started to question more in depth some aspects that are not usually covered in the engineering studies. So that's why I was very excited to do this podcast and be able to know more about also some controversial aspects.
Nice. And what about you, Adam?
Yeah, anyone who's listened to some of the other episodes, I think I've mentioned automation a few times. I kind of come almost from the opposite direction from Virginia, in that I don't know very much about the technicalities of engineering or robotics or anything like that. I think I originally, when I was very young, I read a lot of science fiction. I still read a lot of science fiction, but I read a lot of classic science fiction, and I was very much sort of the opinion, or I believed that the issues in society, well, obviously we just didn't have the technologies, we didn't have the tools, and as soon as we got those technologies or tools, everything would be fine, like we'd work things out. And as I've got older and studied a bit more about sort of economics and how the world works, basically, I've realized that often we do have the tools, it's just how you apply those tools that's important. So I moved from being sort of very sort of a techno-utopian to being more sort of, okay, technology is really important, I still believe that, but we've got to work out the systems by which we use it and the ways in which we develop it. So I now come out of it from a sort of more, I've read a lot of stuff from the more utopian literature side, but also certain sort of left accelerationists, as it's called, which are people who think automation is great on the left and it'll usher in some new stuff. But I also have my own criticisms of it.
Nice, cool. Well, speaking for myself, I didn't know much about it either, and I hadn't really thought a lot about it, especially not in sort of a societal sense. But it'll be interesting to hear what you guys have to say, and I think I'm mostly the host for today, so I will try to come at this from a fairly sort of not knowing much perspective, and I'll try to get you guys to put some words on what is happening here and how we should think about it in the future. So let's start with some of the basics here. What is automation exactly? Do you guys have a good definition of what this is?
Automation is a very generic word, okay, that just defines an automatic process, so usually enabled by technology. So this then isn't only a recent word about futuristic stuff, but it can actually be referred to many things, especially from the engines invented during the first industrial revolution. Okay, to the computers, to the latest developments of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with that. It's really anything that you no longer need to use human labor to do because you have a tool to do it often, or that it will facilitate those things. So any kind of tool that before you had to dig by hand and now you've got something that can do it more efficiently, for instance.
Yeah, actually, you don't necessarily need that there was someone doing that some human force doing that process before, and then you automate it. Then you have automation. That you have automation. Actually, there are also some automatic processes that are just doing a task that before wasn't done by human. So yeah, it's in general an automatic process that doesn't require.
I suppose I should rephrase that as it would have required someone to do it if it was going to be done. But you're right.
Yeah. No, it's only because it has actually this distinction has actually so important impact also on the economics and the employment results of it.
Why is it important?
It's because if a kind of automation is replacing some job that was already existent and already done by humans, then of course it has an impact on employment and just job displacement. While if it is doing something that was not done by human or done very little, okay, then at least we don't observe the same.
Yeah, I mean, in the context we're talking now, in a modern context, we do tend to be talking about more technological, advanced machinery or advanced computing or that kind of stuff. But I do think it is important, like you say, Virginia, to point out that it's not new in a certain sense. You can have very simple things that automate processes.
But just out of curiosity, is a windmill automation, or does it require steam or electricity, or like where does the historical line for automation go here?
I would say a windmill, like in the broadest definitional sense, a windmill would count as automation because you were taking power from the wind and applying that to a process of grinding corn that previously, before you had windmills, you would have required to do by hand or, and this is kind of the halfway step, by animal power. You would have had an animal turning a mill.
Right.
Which you could argue is also a kind of automation.
So if we have a very broad definition of it, it's maybe a process that we've been contending with for a long time, actually. But obviously things are maybe happening quicker now, or I don't know what kind of elements that sort of make automation relevant now that maybe have been irrelevant before, or I don't know. Why are we talking about automation right now?
I think a big thing right now is computing and the power of computing and what we're doing with it. Because there's a lot of processes now that can be to some degree automated, and you can argue how effective they are and how much you need to adjust the work processes, but things that just simply, even 50 years ago, just would have required a person to do, that can now be through you've got AI automation, but you can also do things in warehouses or with industrial robots or that kind of stuff. I think maybe we'll get into that a bit later. But I think there's a lot of developments in machinery and machine learning and AI and robotics and that kind of stuff that are very important now, that have an impact now, especially in the current economic context.
Would you say it's accurate that maybe the technology of automation is accelerating and maybe at an exponential rate, so it becomes more and more relevant quicker and quicker, maybe? Is that a good way of phrasing?
About that, I think that there are some mixed opinions. Because I think that we have already witnessed, we, not we as persons, but as the human race, we have already witnessed exponential acceleration with the first industrial revolution, or also with the second or the third. So I think it's from there that we started seeing a much faster change, and then also people worrying about it and people talking about it while they didn't do before. And then about this new automation wave about artificial intelligence, actually there are people who say that we are going to see a very dramatic acceleration in growth and productivity, but there are also people who say that this wave of automation is not as radical as the previous ones that we had, so that we are not going to have the same growth and amount of new jobs and opportunities as we had before.
Yeah, I think obviously there's the technological thing going on now, but yes, there are people, like I've just reading this book called Automation and the Future of Work by Aaron Beninav, and despite what the name says, he actually argues that the productivity gains of automation haven't actually been that great. The way we see things is to do with the fall in output versus there have been productivity gains, but there's people who debate how much it's a thing or how fast it's happening, and also how viable it is. Like, yes, maybe it's technically possible, but is it going to happen? I think the debate's still out. There's some very profound research by Carl Benedict Frey and stuff that's predicted like up to 47% of certain jobs will be automated. There's some people who debate it. I think the issue now is that, yes, we have these new technologies that have been disrupting the way we live. Like information technologies, especially in the last 20 years, have been huge in the way we interact. They've created whole new forms of interaction and disrupted a lot of the traditional ways. Like even if, I mean, this doesn't really fall under necessarily automation, but things like news cycles and that kind of stuff. And also that we're living in an economic period where growth is running into issues. There's deindustrialization. There's all that kind of stuff, which makes people worried about jobs. And there's increasing precarity. And also that, to get into the more economic sides of things, with capital returns declining, investing in automation could become one way for capitalists to reinvest their capital, which would, in the long run, potentially produce some labour results. Although whether that's going to happen or not is a more complex question.
Okay, so in this topic, we're maybe not exactly sure what will happen, and we might actually be worrying about a lot of things for no reason, maybe, or what's your sense of this?
It might be, but it might also be that we're not worrying enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think like things are changing in how we do things. That's undebatable, and we have to work out where we're going. Yeah. I think, and this is the complicated thing, that some people, like a lot of the left accelerationists.
Who are the left
so that's people like Aaron Bastani, who did fully automated luxury communism. It's people like Nick Chernicek and Alex Williams, who did Inventing the Future. They're very like, okay, automation is going to come and it's going to decouple some fundamental things to do with scarcity in our economies. And because of that decoupling, and the decoupling is already happening, often there with information technology, like because scarcity online is kind of artificial in the sense that you can copy information. It doesn't cost anything to copy information. So their argument is already disrupting certain scarcity things, which will disrupt the economy. It'll bring on this more utopian world. Often, there's some people who say it's not actually happening, or that there'll be issues, or how is it going to happen under different economic systems is important. I tend to be one of those. And there's also a very good book called Four Futures by Peter Fraze, which is a very simple book, but he does sort of a thought experiment showing that there's a variety of different outcomes that could come from this, that could be very extremely positive or very extremely negative. There'll probably be some combination of the two, but it depends. It's contingent on a lot of different political, social, cultural factors and how we approach them. And I think that's why it's important, because things are changing. We're obviously at a crisis stage in multiple different areas, and this is one element of those areas, which is why I mentioned it in a lot of debates.
Yeah. No, but it makes sense, because I think when a lot of people hear automation, it has a bit of a sci-fi ring to it, and it maybe sounds like something we don't really need to worry about, but hopefully, I think during this podcast here we will, and maybe the listeners also, will have a bit more of an idea of how automation might impact society and our lives in a very concrete way. And you mentioned this thing with jobs just now, Adam. Maybe we should transition into that area. To what extent do you think automation will replace humans in the jobs that exist today?
In general, many researchers think that at least half of the current jobs can be replaced. And that, more or less every field will be at least partially automated to a smaller or a bigger degree. In general, there is consensus that the most high-skilled workers will be the ones who keep their jobs to some extent, especially the people who will be able to program or design or be creative and then work with the machines. So it will be the one that will have a job that will be complementary to the machines, to the robots. So they will be the ones whose wages will probably increase very much as the automation will be relevant in future economics. On the other hand, also very low-skilled labor, as dog walkers or security or cleaners, will probably not very easily be automated.
Can I ask why?
Yeah, it's just how current automation is developing.
So it's not that we're just making machines that can do certain tasks. You also have to change the conditions in which those tasks are carried out, oftenly. So like in a warehouse that's very neatly stacked and everything, you can make it's still very complicated, but like a fairly simple machine that goes to this slot and does this. I think in a lot of those conditions, like with dock workers, it's a very messy, contingent environment that's harder to automate in those ways because there's a lot of unforeseen. Even with self-driving cars, you've seen the amount of difficulties they've run into. Now, imagine there's lots of people moving around. There's ships, there's cargo containers, there's all kinds of stuff. I think there's an element of that. I think there's also an economic element, which might be. Well, I'll get into that later.
Yeah. So there are also some low-skilled jobs that still need human supervision. Okay, especially if they require taking care of other people or other animals, and that is currently difficult to be done entirely by a machine. While the sector, this class of jobs that is probably going to suffer the most from automation is the middle low skilled jobs. In general, we foresee that then people will be pushed either on the high-skilled jobs or the low-skilled jobs, so increasing inequalities even more than today.
I see. But can you define because what exactly does automation do, and why are some jobs in jeopardy while others persist? What exactly is it that automation can do, that it can do so much better than humans?
The class of jobs that is most likely to be automated or is already being automated is office jobs, administrative tasks, works in shops. So all the jobs that require routine tasks.
Just to build on that, like a lot of what industrialization did, and the way our work processes, which still are based off industrialized techniques, worked, was to try and make people more like machines, right? That's what the assembly line is. Instead of like one person builds a whole car, they just repeat the same very simple task, right? And the kind of jobs that we put in those frames, they're much easier to automate because you just have to get the thing doing one single task rather than getting a machine that can assemble an entire car. You build a machine that does this bolt, you build a machine that does that. So I think there's that element in it. So in those jobs that are routine, like you say,
yes,
that are like also dealing with huge amounts of data. So it's also entry-level jobs I've heard, like lawyers, a lot of entry-level lawyer positions. It's just like reading through case studies and reading through all this stuff, which with machine learning, there's arguments about how effective it is, but you can do that quite efficiently. And the high-level lawyers don't need to deal with that, but the entry-level lawyers might, for instance.
But is it maybe then? Does it maybe make more sense to talk about this topic of, which jobs will be replaced? Is it maybe more sensible to look at what kind of tasks are being done rather than the status of the job? Like for example, I think radiologists, from what I can tell, is one profession that is very likely to disappear quickly. As from what I can understand, the role of the doctor in that setting is to analyze pictures and look for tumors, I think. I might be revealing my lack of knowledge on this specific topic here. But I think in essence, they're trying to analyze pictures and find anomalies, which it turns out computers are very good at.
Yeah,
right?
deep learning now is developing a lot of techniques in analyzing and getting data from pictures. So, yes.
I mean, maybe we'll get on deep learning later, but I will say one issue with that is that it doesn't actually like learn from doing, it learns from data. So you still like, if you need like a ton of historical data, often for people to do in a lot of those conditions. I'm not sure in the radiologist one. But I think also in your question, okay, you're saying which jobs are going to be replaced. I think you can also usefully divide that up and say which jobs might we technically be able to replace and which jobs economically in our current system will we be afforded to replace, and like which jobs might we consider it desirable to replace. Because there's also something like technology isn't just like this big blanket thing that advances, or like they make choices about which technology to choose and which technology to develop further and where to put your effort. So there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of stuff being pumped into right now, surveilling workers in Amazon warehouse. But, you know, there's a lot of technologies or development pumped into that, or like into that, like Uber app stuff, rather than necessarily replacing those workers, but to try and push them to be more efficient, because that's the economic system we exist in. And like there's jobs that I think, yes, repetitive jobs might be easy to replace, whatever they are. But then there's the question of whether it's economically viable to replace those jobs, or economically desirable from a capitalist society perspective to replace those jobs. Because if you can find cheaper labor to do those jobs, and use automation to sort of just push people to be more productive, in the long run probably not be more productive, then that's probably what's going to happen under this current system. In another system, you might think, okay, what jobs do we not want to do? We'll develop a lot more technology in that direction. And those will have different outcomes, depending on how it's politically framed. Because there might be jobs that are easy to automate, or even that are totally unnecessary, but that we keep because the people who have them have a lot of political influence, for instance. Or they're a core constituency in a demographic or something like that, you know.
So it's not only a question of what is possible or what is, you know, strictly rational from a efficiency standpoint of view. There's also an element of incentives and maybe profits as well, which affects what jobs will probably be automated soon.
Yes, and while it might be that a task is entirely possible to be automated, but then it is not, because it's not economically convenient, because probably the machine will cost more than the labor. But on the other hand, there are also some tasks that are more expensive, maybe are more expensive to run with machines, and you don't gain so much in productivity while replacing workers with the machines, but they still do it, and it's because in some cases actually the incentives for automation are stronger than incentives for workers, because maybe there are some discrepancies in taxation that make labor taxed more than capital, so there is this distortion for which then it's more convenient to buy technology than to hire a new worker, even though the machine is not more efficient than the worker. Or also there might be concerns about what will the worker claim for himself or herself, because a machine will not have the same expectations about rights or maternity leave, or will not complain if there is a wage cut. So this is also something that can be an incentive for employers to buy a machine instead of a worker, even though the machine is more expensive.
Right. So less of a hassle, because with a human you have to deal with, you know, basic needs and emotions and all sorts of impractical things.
And I think this is also why it's really important to talk about this topic. Maybe there's things we want to do with automation so that we can do other things than jobs, but also if it happens within our current system, because of those incentives, it could change the structure. You know, we've seen for a long time that the power of labor has been weakened, unions have been in a weaker position, precaritization has happened. if you have more and more automation, that further weakens the power of workers to go on strike, to do that kind of stuff. They're not necessary. The extreme situation would be workers are no longer necessary. I don't think realistically that's going to happen. But there could be a lot more precarity in the labor market, as we've seen already with a lot of jobs. Like people are less able to claim protections or better wages or whatever because there's more competition for fewer jobs, or it's easier to just replace them. So it could be that balance which will slowly suppress wages and concentrate power. And that's the other issue, which is like, if that happens under a capitalist system, you get someone like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or whatever, they'll invest and invest and invest and invest. This happened with Uber. They were using the money they got from the app while all their workers were doing a bunch of work to try and invest in self-driving cars to make those workers redundant, right? Because that way they can make profits and they don't have to push so much stuff out. And this will just further increase this thing that we're always talking about, which is the power of a very narrow elite. Because basically if you can replace labor with capital, which is what you can do with automation, then you cut that element out of the equation and you concentrate more and more power in people who have all of the capital. So it could lead to an even deepening concentration of power and wealth, which could have broader effects on our society.
Right.
Which is related to the job thing, but I think that's also very important. That's the other side of it. On the one hand, you have people potentially losing their jobs, but on the other hand, you have a concentration of power, which puts people in a much worse position.
So a big worry for a lot of people in terms of automation is what you're saying, like, will we have jobs? And what will happen to those of us who don't have jobs? Do you think it's likely that there will always be jobs for humans to do, or does this topic touch in on maybe a more sort of profound change in society as we move forwards?
I think that if there will be jobs for everyone in the future also depends on which kind of change is going to artificial intelligence do in the current economic structure. So if this wave of automation is going to create a totally different economical structure with a lot of new jobs that we cannot imagine now, like the first industrial revolution did. And in this case, yes, there will be probably jobs for everyone. There will be only new jobs that now don't exist, that will be created by the new wave of automation. But on the other hand, if the current wave of automation is just going to replace existing tasks, but not going to create anything new, no new sector or no new tasks, then no, we are going only to be always fewer and fewer people employed.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there are any jobs that people should do or only people can do?
So I have a quite complicated answer to your first question, right. which builds on what Virginia is saying. So the classic capitalist answer is, okay, new technological innovation will create jobs. We'll have new jobs, and that'll be great. Everyone will be employed. Fantastic. That's the constant argument for growth, right? Growth will, yes, it maybe messes things up, but it will create new jobs and everything will be fine in the long run. It's a weird thing where you're kind of running two things at the same time and hoping that growth kind of runs faster than the destruction of stuff. So the classic capitalist answer, the economists will say, it'll create new jobs. I would say to that, not necessarily. You never know exactly what conditions will emerge. Like I say, it might be precarity of labor. Also, you don't know that those jobs will necessarily be desirable. Will they be in good conditions? Will be the kind of jobs that people want to do? You don't know that those jobs will be necessary if it's just make work because we have this economic system and we could have a different, more luxury-oriented or more free time because we're stuck in the system where you need to pay capital owners for whatever. That's one of the scenarios of the Four Futures book that I mentioned, where you have sort of an entirely rentier capitalist economy where, okay, everything can be reproduced really cheaply, which you pretty much can online, like data can be reproduced, but you have to constantly pay for subscriptions to things or pay for access to like a copyright. And that's also why intellectual property has exploded in recent years, because that's a way of protecting the capital there. So they might not, you might be in a condition where you have to work shitty jobs that you don't want to work just because that's the economic system. And you don't have to work just because that's the economic system we have. I'd also point out, and we talked about this earlier, Virginia, but he also mentions it in the book, Carl Benedict Frey and the Technology Trap. I have issues with his book because I think he misses out. He talks about the Industrial Revolution. I think he misses out a bit the role of colonialism, and later about, as far as I've read, about the labor movement for improving conditions. But as he does point out, yes, in the long run, the Industrial Revolution produced jobs, but and I would say that's also partially because of the labor movement. But for hundreds of years, the conditions of workers in Great Britain were worse than they had been before. People's lives were shorter. They lived in slums. It was awful. So it's not necessarily a given that the conditions will be good. And then also, building on that, I would say then we have to question, are jobs or working or the way we think about jobs desirable? I think people have an inherent tendency to want to do stuff, right? You can see that around. People get bored. They want to do things. But this current system where we have to work a job for our basic needs, is that necessarily desirable in all conditions if we have the abundance to do without that? Would it be better if we were a system where people could choose more or to engage in more care work or more that?
Could you maybe explain a little bit why? Because it sounds weird that you would work just because you need to work. Like this system you're referring to, how does this work? Why are jobs necessary if the product of the job or the labor is not necessarily, productive? So
we are so entrenched in a capitalist system where most people have to work because if they don't, they can't meet their basic needs, right? Because the current reigning economic orthodoxy is that we're all profit motivated effectively, and that's the only reason we do stuff. But a lot of people still choose to do activities outside of that, or choose to do jobs that are more difficult or that are different because they're passionate about that, right? We're here today. No one's paying us to be here today. We're here today because we think it's important. It's not like problems are just going to go away. There'll still be social problems. There'll still be the need for care. We'll still have social lives. And that depends on all kinds of conditions. We still want to do things that, like, fundamentally people enjoy doing stuff. But I have a really good quote, actually, from Arthur C. Clarke, famous science fiction author. He said, "The goal of the future is full unemployment so we can play. That's why we have to destroy the present politico-economic system." He also said, "The greatest single occupation of the future will be education. The second greatest occupation will be entertainment. I think the two should be synonymous." So I think that's also his kind of answer. And there's also stuff from Keynes of Keynesian economics. He had a bunch of quotes about how we would want to work. So his worry, writing in, I think, the mid-50s, he was certain that the productivity gains that we did in the end get, well, we distribute them more evenly, which we could have done. We have the capital, but we haven't done that because of the economic system. He was convinced that, like, one of the problems would be, well, everyone would want to work, so we'd need to spread out the work more evenly. He used the term, "The old Adam will be so strong in us that everyone will need to get some work if he is to be contented." I assume Adam is, the, like, drive to work. But he talks about, like, 3-hour shifts or a 15-hour work week. But I think that, for me, that's kind of one answer of how you'd approach that. There will be work, but how you approach that is important.
Yeah, about the what will lack of work, at least in the sense we are used to think about it now, mean for a person. More psychologically, I have read another interesting point from A World Without Work by Thompson, who points out that right now we are very used to think about formal employment, full-time employment, or unemployment as a binary thing, a black and white thing, but that it has not always been like that, because before the Industrial Revolution, people didn't have formal, many people at least didn't have formal jobs, so they were doing home tasks, agriculture, sewing, but it was not a full-time employment as we think about it now. Okay, but still people had plenty of things to do even during the worst crisis. So that actually the problem, also on a psychological point of view of unemployment, is something that we started to perceive only after the beginning of factory work. So after the beginning of capitalism, then, as Adam said, that it's a very capitalist way of seeing it. So I So according to A World Without Work, when there will be when most of the tasks that we know now will be automated, then the life of people will be more similar to what were life of people in the 18th century. At least this is his point of view. At least because there will not be formal jobs as there have been since the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, the Industrial Revolution, it introduced also like some ideological things around work, but also that you needed to have a job to meet your basic needs, and that the enclosure of the commons and taking people off common land, that was a key element in that, to force people to work in factories. And also, we live in a society that has made everything sort of economicized, to use a horrible term. But like unpaid labor, like household labor, women do a ton of household labor that's still unpaid today. Is that not meaningful? Is raising children not meaningful? Is caring for your family not meaningful? And also a lot of the stuff that maybe maybe we'll get into this a bit more later, but like a lot of the stuff like, okay, in Denmark I noticed, in blocks of flats, instead of hiring in cleaners often, people in the blocks, they'll have a rota to clean the stairs, right? And little things, maintaining our community, maintaining our social networks that have often been disaggregated by trying to reduce everything to economics, I think might be an essential part of that. Because also there's a lot of jobs that now, like, they're undesirable jobs, but people need money, for instance, that maybe can't be automated, so we'll share them more equally. Or that, there's a lot of different things we can do that are either economicized now, which I hate that term, but I can't think of a better term, or that are unpaid now, but that we could actually, a lot of people don't spend enough time with their families.
So it sounds like what you're saying, at least in part, is that automation might be on a collision course with how we perceive work today and jobs today.
Yeah, and I'd also like to point out, historically speaking, now we're used to the 35-hour work week or whatever it is in Denmark. They fought for shorter working hours. There was a movement called the 888 thing, which was about having 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of sleep, and 8 hours of work, which was a thing. And up until really historically recently, one of the main things of the labor movement wasn't with like what would happen with the increased productivity, wasn't raising wages necessarily. It was reducing the working week, which they consistently did. So the only reason we have as shorter working week as we do is because people fought for it. But like a lot of people took it for granted. Yes, you'd want more leisure time. That would be a sensible thing to plow stuff into. Now we live in a society that's obsessed with work, as if like unless it's paid labor, it doesn't mean anything.
Obviously, scarcity in food and production in general. It'd be nice if we can do away with that. We don't necessarily need to work tedious jobs. Like, it would be nice to do without. But it sounds like from what you're saying that automation clashes a little bit with the system that we have today. And also, obviously, automation has potential to create more inequality. And so there are some problematic aspects of automation that has maybe more to do with how we apply automation and who gets to use it, right? So how do you imagine that we might tackle these problems going forwards?
I think that there are many different approaches, and that also depend on how the future is really going to be. But reading the article Automation and the Inequalities by Norton, I could read at least 3 categories of measures to address inequalities. The first is pre-distribution, so how to distribute wealth before the labor, so how to enhance the possibility for everyone to work with automation. That is mainly education, so like that not only few people will have the skills to work and program machines, because this is a very crucial point, that the skills required to work will change, and that everybody or more people will have the possibility to work with that. Then there is a distribution within the labor market, and that is about making automation available for everyone. So enhancing digital infrastructures where there are not. So maybe especially in poor countries or poor contexts. And then there are the post-distribution solutions that deal with the redistribution of wealth. So from taxes to more radical solutions like universal basic income. In general, a robot tax would be useful to limit the excessive automation. So all the cases that I mentioned before, in which machines are just bought because they create less problems than workers, but they don't really enhance productivity much. So this distortion will be limited by robot taxes. I think that taxation would need to change in a way that includes more taxation on wealth, because in a future where automation will be dominant in the work system, then the importance of wealth over labor, wealth will be way more important than labor in this future economic system. So we need a way to account for wealth in a better way than we do now. And also, if the taxes are going to stay like now, we will have an always lower tax base, because there will be always fewer people working or working for fewer hours. So we will not have much power to redistribute wealth if we don't have that tax base.
Mm. So it sounds like at least some of the things that you are talking about here sort of stays within the confines of the capitalist society or system as we know it right now.
Yes, this what I just talked about. Is our solutions on how to account for changing working structure. With the tools that we have used until now.
Yeah.
To talk to those solutions, I do think often, obviously we have to work with what we have. But I think one key thing in any solution that works within the realms of capitalism, I guess two key issues. One is that it's working on a logic of scarcity that isn't necessarily there anymore. And two is that often the power of labor, for instance, has been the ability to strike. And that's what has forced changes. Whereas if you don't have that anymore, there's a lot of doubts around how much will be automated. But assuming a lot of stuff is automated and you do it under a capitalist system, that gives them more and more power, which then I think the danger would be, you can just pressure the government into changing things. So it's not necessarily a sustainable solution, I would argue. And a lot of the counter solutions don't really address the fundamental issue of power and economic power, which is already very powerful, but which I would argue would be more so. But I think a lot of, and that's where the sort of left accelerationists come in, and I disagree with them on that it's inevitable, but I agree with them in some sense. They say that yes, automation is the way because it disrupts that fundamental logic of scarcity, that things are necessarily scarce and you have to pay for them. So the alternative is rentier capitalism, or there's a way out of that through what you might call a post-scarcity economy. What that might look like, I mean, that's a big question. I think that really, and that's why I think the Four Futures book is really good, for instance, because he gives at least two options of the more utopian one and two options of the more dystopian, where you sort of keep the hierarchies of capitalism. But for instance, solutions that might be external are socialization. So in the most basic form, you could nationalize all the robots. That's problematic too. We've seen historically. I wouldn't really like that. But let's say we go, instead of allowing people who have a lot of wealth to decide what machines get bought, what machines get built, what they produce, you have some system where it's democratically controlled. Why not, right? So that's one solution, democratically owned and democratically decided. The specifics are complicated as always. Because that would sort of help even out the power distribution, as long as people had access to it and had a say in it, which I think would fit with the supposed values of our society.
Automation have some very positive promises from what you're saying. One hopeful view of the future is that leisure and work will somehow melt together to be this existence that is nice, and you have you have food on the table and a house above your head, right?
Yeah, this only if the economic system will actually take care of the people without a job.
And I think that's the key thing, right? it's a possibility with automation, as it was a possibility with also industrialization, I think, in the right political conditions to improve a lot of people's lives. I don't think it's a given that automation is going to give us these things. Right. I think it's possible. And as such, we should question how we think about work and why we believe it's so desirable to work all the time, as if that's where all meaning in our lives comes from.
Right. Well, that's all we have time for now. Thank you so much for coming, both of you, Adam and Virginia.
Thank you.
And for your insights. My name is still Edward, and if you thought this episode was interesting, there are plenty more on this channel already, and more to come in the future. This podcast is made in collaboration with Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke, which is a Danish NGO that works for a more just and sustainable world. You can come down to Café Mellemfolk every day but Sunday for amazing food, drinks, and events in a cozy cafe run by our lovely volunteers. You can also get involved with our events, activities, and campaigns, and even running the cafe as a volunteer yourself. Thank you everyone for listening in, and until next time, goodbye.